Hello, everyone. Welcome both to our in-person audience and to those joining online. We are going to buck the usual academic trend and actually start on time. I hope you don't find that too disconcerting. Apparently, I need to be closer to the microphone. Okay. Nice to see all of you here. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to the University of Washington. For those of you who are coming from off campus, and for the students that are here, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this space. My name is Danny Hoffman. I am the interim director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies here at the University of Washington. And I'm very proud to be able to kick off this evening's event, Storm Clouds Over the Pacific, Impacts of the Ukrainian Invasion on China-Taiwan-U.S. Relations. Now, as many of you know, at the Jackson School, we take very seriously our role both on campus and in our community as being a resource for understanding and contextualizing issues that are challenging the world today. During the pandemic, we found creative ways to do that, but I think there's really something special about being able to bring people back into the same space to have these kinds of conversations. And of course now being able to benefit from the technologies that allow us to make an event like this hybrid. I want to first, because of the complexity of putting this together, I think it's important to start with a quick thank you to the Jackson School China Studies Program, Taiwan Studies Program, and East Asia Center staff who have worked very hard to make sure that we can have events like this. I'm grateful to all of your contributions. Now, a quick word about how this particular event came about. I think many of us watched the Russian invasion of Ukraine last February with horror. And we have been doing a number of events, and will be doing a number of events in the Jackson School that speak directly to the issues on the ground in Ukraine. But we also knew that it was important to look beyond Ukraine. When there's an event like this that challenges the world order, it has many downstream impacts that it's important to be thinking about now. Our Jackson School China Studies Program, Taiwan Studies Program, and East Asia Title VI centers are all internationally recognized for their expertise in this field. We have an extraordinary roster of faculty, staff, and students, and so it seemed obvious that this would be the kind of conversation that we could host and needed to host as part of this important moment. So we have organized this as a moderated discussion. The panelists that will be introduced to you in a second will each give kind of short introductory remarks. Our moderator will pose the first questions, and then we'll open the floor to you all for questions and conversation. The way this will work, this microphone will actually be moved over there. And so if you have a question at the appropriate moment, if you would just kind of queue up at the microphone and please keep it short. So before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to acknowledge, as we always do at our Jackson School events, that we are on Coast Salish territory, the traditional homelands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and other indigenous peoples. The Jackson School understands that the international community includes sovereign American Indian tribes, First Nations, and indigenous peoples across the world. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Anand Yang. Anand is an historian by training. He began his career exploring agrarian relationships in colonial northern India, gradually widening his lens to look at the ways ordinary men and women engaged with market economies in colonial India, followed by a series of extraordinary projects on Indian labor across Southeast Asia, China, and across the Caribbean and Pacific. And many of you will know that Anand, will know Anand through his tenure as a previous director of the Jackson School from 2002 until 2010. And I can't really think of anybody better suited to moderate this discussion. So please join me in welcoming our moderator and thanking Dr. Anand Yang.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Is this mic on? A little bit closer. So my task is an easy one. I get to sit alongside a panel of distinguished colleagues who are extremely well qualified to negotiate the Taiwan Strait crises, to help us understand the changing geopolitical context in which the nexus between China, Taiwan, and the United States is currently playing out. David Bachman, the person farthest to my left, is the Associate Director of the Jackson School and the former head of the China program, and he will start us off. a scholar of Chinese politics and foreign policy. He has written extensively about modern and contemporary China, particularly its military-industrial complex, and is often featured in the national and international media as the go-to expert about everything from the US congressional visit to Taiwan to the Beijing Olympics. Our second speaker is James Lin. He is the first faculty member to be hired as part of the Jackson School's newly instituted Taiwan Studies program, which was established with the support of UW, the Taiwan government, and an anonymous donor. A historian and associate chair of UW's Taiwan Studies program, he's currently in the midst of finishing a book entitled, and I think I got the title right, In the Global Vanguard, Taiwan, Agrarian Development, and the World. Our third and final speaker is Tabitha Mallory, a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. She's an affiliate Jackson School faculty member, and perhaps this is equally important, but a former alumnus of the Jackson School. A CEO of the consulting firm China Ocean Institute, she has consulted with numerous multilateral organizations and published scholarly and policy pieces on China's fisheries and ocean policy that grew out of her larger interest in global ocean governance. Following their brief presentations, and I think they're all going to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, so not your typical kind of academic lengthy presentations, I will take advantage of the moderator's prerogative to throw out the first question or two. So I think we're going in alphabetical order, which means David, please start us out.
Well, good evening, and thank you for being here. I'm going to talk about the impacts of the war in Ukraine on China-Taiwan-U.S. relations from the Chinese perspective. And from the Chinese perspective, the impacts of the war on Ukraine were both profound and yet non-transformative, particularly with regard to its Taiwan policy. At the recently concluded 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping, as part of his keynote address, said China faced global challenges of a magnitude not seen in a century. And this struck me as a particularly profound statement, given that in the past century, China has been invaded. We've been through World War II, the nuclear revolution, the fall of communism, and so on, and yet he's seeing recent years, presumably the war in Ukraine and the US sanctions on China, as of a magnitude not seen in a century. So that for Xi, the Chinese position is seemingly less secure than it was several years ago. In terms of the profound things that have impacted China's thinking about the war in Ukraine that have bearing on China's foreign policy and relations with the US and Taiwan, there are 5 general areas where I think the PRC is recalculating, rethinking, trying to understand what's going on. Those 5 areas are Russia's failures, the Ukrainian resistance, the sanctions employed by the US and its allies, the effectiveness of US and European weapons, and the impact of the war on China. And I'll speak briefly about each one of these. So in terms of Russia's failure, and this is important because the Chinese military practices with the Russian military. It buys some Russian military equipment. It's barred from buying Western military equipment. The Russian military had been fighting wars, or at least major military activities in the Caucasus, in Syria, in Africa, and so it was thought to be an up-to-date modern military. And yet it failed in terms of planning, in terms of equipment not working very well, in terms of coordinating its military activities. This was, in theory, an experienced military force. So what can China take from this? The Russian Air Force failed to obtain air superiority. Command failures led to lack of a successful offensive. Like China, Russia lacks a professional non-commissioned officer class. So junior officers are supposed to be guiding men. That didn't seem to be working well. Like China, Russia has a draft military, people going through their own desire to get out of service as soon as possible, not necessarily committed to this, and so on. And it seemed that Russia's cyber attacks were either failed or thwarted. So as a result of this, China is wondering what it actually is learning from the Russian military, sorry. The second area was the Ukrainian resistance. Clearly, the one lesson there is the power of nationalism and the motivation of the population, that overcoming a much larger, seemingly more technologically advanced force, and as well, the seeming speed by which the Ukrainian forces have mastered Western equipment, neutralized the Russian Air Force. A third area of profound impact on China was the US and allied sanctions on Russia. The breadth, depth, and severity of those sanctions were shocking to the Chinese. Freezing of bank accounts, freezing of using the dollar, and so on. All of these pose a real challenge for the Chinese. The Allied unity so far is also something of a surprise. They anticipated that the Russians would try to split Europe, or at least some Europeans from the US. They haven't been successful in doing that so far. As well, they're surprised by the willingness of the Europeans, again so far, to bear the energy costs of resisting Russia. They are understanding, the Chinese are understanding, the long-term damage to Russia's economy and international reputation undertaken as a result of the invasion. A fourth area that causes China to rethink is the effectiveness of US and European weapons. So even without the huge quantities of weapons that the Ukrainians want, or the full spectrum of weapons that they're also asking for, these have proven much more effective than the Russian equipment that the Russians are deploying, seemingly with implications for US equipment for Taiwan. And then finally, in terms of the impacts that cause profound reflection in China, the impact of the war on China itself. So there's been growing relative isolation, at least by Western powers of Western states towards China, and a hardening of views towards China by many Western nations, thanks to the partnership without limits proclaimed by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin 3 weeks before the invasion began. China, of course, has been able to buy a lot of oil and grain from Russia at a discount, and indeed profoundly increased its trade with Russia. But the inflationary impacts of the war are likely to tip many developing countries into debt crises, making it difficult for them to pay for Chinese exports and repay Belt and Road loans. At a time of slowing Chinese economic growth, this means exports are not likely to be a leading sector for China's economic recovery. Finally, the outcome of the war in Ukraine will have a major impact, whether it's a loss or war or loss of power. So if we know Russian history, we know that when Russia loses wars, so it lost the Crimean War in the 1850s, and you freed the serfs 5 years later. They lost World War I, and you overthrew the Tsar's system and replaced it with the Bolsheviks. They didn't do well in Afghanistan, and it contributed to the fall of communism. So if Russia were to lose the war, will this mean the fall of Vladimir Putin or a change in the Russian system? And if that happens, what's the implication for Xi Jinping and thinking about military force in the Taiwan Strait? So China has begun to learn lessons from all of these. It's increasingly using the renminbi for international trade clearance rather than the dollar. It has slowly begun to reduce its holdings of US treasuries. China now holds less than $1 trillion of US treasuries. It is calling for greater technological self-reliance, not to be dependent on outside forces as much as it had been. It continues to try to divide the US and Europe. In its negotiations, diplomacy with Western powers and with other powers, tries to reinforce the one China principle, the idea that there's only one China in the world and that Taiwan is part of it. But one also wonders what the Chinese, and indeed what we're all thinking about, if the war in Ukraine has created so many economic costs from economic actions taken against Russia that really was important in only two international key commodity areas, oil and grain. What would it mean if there was a war over Taiwan, where Taiwan is critical in one key commodity, semiconductors, and China is deeply integrated still into huge numbers of supply chains? Who has leverage in this situation? Is it the Chinese? Is it the people imposing the sanctions? Would U.S. allies in Asia and Europe sanction China even if the U.S. did in the event of Taiwan contingencies? So those are some of the profound issues that China is thinking about, or Chinese leaders are thinking about with regard to the war in Ukraine. But this hasn't caused major changes in its policy towards Taiwan. Indeed, there's a great deal of continuity of China's Taiwan's policy, but with an acceleration of several major trends. So China has denied the parallel that many Western and American analysts made between Russia, Ukraine, and China and Taiwan. From China's perspective, they're entirely different situations. Ukraine was an internationally recognized state. Indeed, Russia recognized Ukraine. Taiwan in the PRC is not. PRC view is not. China recently put out a new white paper on the reunification with Taiwan. Xi Jinping spoke about it in the 20th Party Congress. It's clear that from the PRC's perspective, what it calls reunification will take place either through negotiated means, which is preferred, or through military actions. The strategy seems to be, overall, to wear down Taiwan's will to resist, to convince Taiwan that there is no other possible outcome, that reunification is inevitable, and basically cut the best deal you can and submit to the inevitable. To do this, though, China, Xi Jinping, in his 20th Party Congress speech, called for an acceleration of military modernization from the year 2035 to 2027. 2027 is, well, recently China has been emphasizing what it calls the two centenaries, one being 100 years since the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. That was in 1921. The second would be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic in 2049. 2027 will have two other centenaries that they don't talk about as much. One would be the centenary of the founding of what's now known as the People's Liberation Army, the founding of the PLA. The other centenary, though, and I think this is in the back of Xi Jinping's mind, is the 100th anniversary of the start of civil war between the Kuomintang and the CCP. And I think Xi Jinping, in his heart of hearts, would prefer that there be an end to what China sees as the Chinese Civil War in 2027. Whether he's prepared to act on that or not remains to be seen, but I think that is part of what he's thinking about. It also would be another party Congress in 2027, which may give Xi a fourth term in office. So while this is going on, there's an intensification of military actions in and around Taiwan. There's a reassertion of China's red lines about Taiwan. This was part of the long conversation that Xi Jinping and President Biden had yesterday. And China is busy trying to deter Japan, South Korea, and Australia, and others from interfering in China-Taiwan relations. But at the same time this is going on, the CCP seems to be defining the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, the ruling party in Taiwan, as separatists. And following the redefinition of one country, two systems in Hong Kong, the Chinese have asserted that only patriots can govern Hong Kong, presumably only patriots can govern Taiwan, which would exclude the DPP from power, if not the kinds of re-education that are taking place among Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So in my view, Xi is deeply concerned about what he sees as the erosion of the U.S.'s one China policy, seen by Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip to China, intensified arms sales, Biden's various statements about coming to Taiwan's defense in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, various acts of legislation that are apt to pass in Congress in the next couple of weeks or months, calls by some to recognize Taiwan, as well as calls by some to end the policy of strategic ambiguity or dual deterrence with a clear declaration of a U.S. military commitment to Taiwan's defense. Xi has spent a lot of time in his meeting with Biden reaffirming the centrality of the Taiwan issue from his perspective to China and to him, and trying to reestablish red lines that the U.S. and Taiwan may not cross. But these red lines, given the partisan nature of U.S. politics these days, may only be seen by one party as a dare to cross and see what happens. The situation is more dangerous, I would argue, than it has been since the early 2000s. China is not preparing for an imminent attack on Taiwan, but it is preparing for an attack on Taiwan. But it is refining the range of gray zone, as strategists call it, of strategies and tactics it can take and will be able to deploy against Taiwan and the U.S. in the event of an end to impatience about reunification. It is prepared to wait and wear down Taiwan's will to resist, to convince them, Taiwan, to accept the inevitable. But the bottom line is that there is no stable status quo across the Taiwan Strait and in U.S.-China relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, a perspective from Taiwan. James?
All right. So thank you. I'll just start. 2 weeks ago, 25-year-old indigenous Taiwanese citizen, Jonathan Zhen Guang, died in the line of fire in Ukraine. He was the first volunteer Taiwanese casualty in the Ukraine war. Since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February, the Taiwanese public has grown increasingly anxious as it saw a large authoritarian nation invade, unprovoked, its smaller democratic neighbor. Though taking place on the other side of the continent, the Ukraine war has captured Taiwanese public attention for good reason. For over the past 70 years, Taiwan has faced a similar threat from its own neighbor across the Taiwan Strait, whose regime has considered Taiwan part of its own national territory. A friend of Zen relayed his motivation for joining the war. Quote, he went to fight because he knew that if he didn't do it, the next battle could happen in his homeland, end quote. Following the ascent of Chinese leader Xi Jinping, Beijing has become increasingly aggressive, leaning into an irredentist nationalism that centers upon a territorial claim to the island of Taiwan. Yet Taiwan, which democratized itself from authoritarian rule in the 1980s and 1990s, has no desire for any kind of political affiliation with the People's Republic of China. Young Taiwanese who grew up in a fully democratic Taiwan, like Jonathan Zen, have overwhelmingly asserted a Taiwanese identity that is separate from and unrelated to China, despite historical ties and migration between the two societies. So what has changed since the invasion of Ukraine for Taiwan? For decades, Taiwan has quietly built a prosperous economy and a pluralistic civil society, despite the possibility of being unwillingly annexed by Beijing. What has changed since the Ukraine war is an increased awareness in Taiwan that the possibility of war is becoming increasingly urgent. We see this in Taiwan's military. Taiwan had been ruled under an authoritarian government for 4 decades, backed by martial law and the power of the military. Since democratization 4 decades ago, Taiwan's investment in its military has fallen off as societies saw in the military an institution that historically has been associated with a secret police that carried out the orders of the authoritarian government to enact terror and to violate human rights. Just a few months ago in August, the Taiwanese government announced a 14% annual increase in defense spending, bringing Taiwan's defense spending to new records. Yet Taiwan's defense is pulled in increasingly different directions as it faces not just a traditional military invasion, but also a range of as Professor Bachman has mentioned, gray zone tactics, from continual aircraft incursions designed to wear down Taiwan's military readiness, to misinformation and disinformation campaigns that are designed to weaken Taiwan's democratic institutions. In Taiwan society, we see an equally striking response over the possibility of war. From journalists in Taiwan, we see reports in the news in the past few months about voluntary training in civil defense. There are makeshift courses offered by Army veterans in local churches teaching civil defense skills like emergency first aid, how to carry a body without the help of a stretcher. One anecdote relayed by Taiwan-based journalist Chris Horton is a surgeon trained in pancreatic surgery, looking to expand into trauma surgery with the expectation that she might one day need to utilize those skills to treat gunshot wounds. Another anecdote relayed by Professor Michelle Guo at National Taiwan University offers his perspective from a young Taiwanese who's determined to stay and fight in the event of a war. His thoughts, quote, "What's even worse than dying is to see a total deterioration of common memory of one's land," end quote. So what hasn't changed since the Ukraine war? Despite the real anxieties engendered by the rising threat from Beijing, Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen from the Democratic Progressive Party has charted, I would argue, a remarkably stable course with long-term goals in mind. Since her first election in 2016, she's asserted a status quo approach to Taiwan's relations with Beijing. Beijing most fears the possibility of Taiwan declaring so-called formal independence, such as the declaration of a Republic of Taiwan, as opposed to its current name, the Republic of China. Tsai has consistently stated that a formal declaration of independence isn't necessary because Taiwan already benefits from de facto independence. And so this stance isn't just meant to reflect what she perceives as reality, but also designed to reassure Beijing that there will be no unilateral provocation from Taipei on the matter of Taiwan's status. Simultaneously, Tsai is seeking to increase awareness of Taiwan's situation internationally, inviting politicians and representatives to visit Taiwan from friendly nations in the West. So she has pursued solidarity with other nations who see Taiwan in a shared struggle. Places like Somaliland, whose sovereignty is internationally contested, like Taiwan's, or Lithuania, which has adopted a so-called values-based foreign policy to build ties with other democratic nations that are also facing threats from authoritarian neighbors. Here, I'll end with brief thoughts about what the future might hold. Perhaps an understated challenge to Taiwan is navigating the minefield of rising US-China tensions. The Taiwan-US relationship has historically been a close one. Taiwan was an integral link in the US anti-communist arc in Asia that contained China during the Cold War. Today, the Taiwan-US relationship is once again growing close. For the US, it once again seeks a counterbalance to Beijing. And for Taiwan, it seeks a friendship with the United States, largely out of necessity, because few countries are willing to risk the ire of Beijing to become close with Taipei. Taiwan has reaped some benefits of this recent attention from Washington, with a new defense bill likely to pass Congress, and a high-profile, albeit risky, recent visit from Speaker Nancy Pelosi. However, as shown with the Pelosi visit, Taiwan must be careful to make sure that it is, while in the act of building its own security and deterring aggression from Beijing, that it doesn't unintentionally provoke a escalating situation. So the Tsai administration has, in my opinion, done a good job of this so far. It's signaled its desire to maintain peace in the Taiwan Strait, which has persisted for the past 6 or so decades. And it has balanced the fine line, managing expectations from both Beijing and Washington, in the hopes that Beijing's irredentist claims do not escalate to military conflict. The Taiwanese understand that any serious escalation of US-China tensions will likely have devastating impacts upon the livelihood of ordinary Taiwanese. This is because Taiwan will almost certainly be caught in the middle of any serious US-China conflict. The millions of Taiwanese who sit atop of these geopolitical fault lines, like Jonathan Zhen, are well aware of this reality. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight, and thanks to the Jackson School for hosting this event, the first, I guess, official event that's in person since the pandemic. So it's great to see everybody. So what I thought I would do is I thought about this question of impacts of the invasion of Ukraine on China-Taiwan-U.S. relations, and came up with about five key factors to consider when we're thinking about this topic. And a couple of them overlap with David, but I think that's kind of interesting that we had some similar opinions on some of these issues and what we decided to highlight. So first of all, I want to make the point that David also made this point too, that there is an important difference, obviously, between comparing the Ukraine issue to the Taiwan issue, in that Ukraine is a sovereign state being invaded by another state, while in China's view, of course, Taiwan is a province, and so this is seen by them as an internal issue. And this has implications in the international community, because if we're thinking about in the event of a war, there's some really important questions about the legality of some of the possible developments. For example, a naval blockade. What's the legality of that in international law? Or entering, Chinese forces entering Taiwan airspace or water, territorial zones, or crossing the median line in the strait, which is not in any way an official established median line, because there was never an armistice agreement between the PRC and the ROC. And so there would be some important issues to grapple with were there to be some kind of contingency like that. And then there's some other issues to think about as well in terms of U.S. foreign policy more generally. For example, if the U.S. won't directly intervene in the Ukraine crisis, but it would in Taiwan, which is recognized as a sovereign state by only a handful of countries around the world, what does that say about U.S. thinking around the world? Second, I think another kind of key factor to keep in mind is that the geographies are very different, and that matters as well. So, in the case of Ukraine, it's been much easier to send reinforcements into Ukraine, whereas this would be much harder for Taiwan because it's an island. And so hence the rush right now to arm Taiwan. Also, we'd have to keep in mind the fact that the terrain in Taiwan is very different from Ukraine. Terrain in Taiwan is much more mountainous. Ukraine is largely flat, and so that means a lot of differing strategies in the approaches for both places. And so nonetheless, kind of my third point here is China is watching very closely for lessons, and David also talked about this a little bit. And so there are kind of a few subpoints here that I have in terms of like the most important lessons that China is paying attention to. So one is they're paying close attention to the reputational and other material costs to Russia. There's been widespread condemnation by the international community, sanctions because of Russia's actions. And also Chinese are paying attention to how much Russia underestimated the Ukrainian response. And I think it's driven home the point that invasion of another country or territory is one thing, but administering that territory once you've taken it over is another. And I think there's some other lessons from history that we can think about too in terms of this. And then there are also important lessons about military strategy and tactics plus hardware. So one of China's big takeaways is, if China were to invade Taiwan, they would have to go big and go fast. Is one of the one of the things in terms of strategy that they would have to consider. But also, I think there have been some other lessons in terms of China's strategy regionally, more broadly. So China uses an anti-access aerial denial strategy for East Asia. I would really say kind of for the area that's within that first island chain. So not just Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait, but also the South China Sea and the the goal of this strategy is to be able to deny U.S. access to the region, essentially, to keep the U.S. out. And so there have actually been some interesting lessons for the Chinese in terms of the strategy from the Russian experience, with the Russian experience being the Black Sea. So for example, it's been interesting, I think, to see that the Russians have, for example, had a much harder time keeping, there's an island in the Black Sea called Snake Island. They've had a much harder time controlling that. They've found it hard to stop the reinforcements from entering the area as well. And so I think it's kind of brought to mind some of the possible weaknesses of their A2AD, as they call it, strategy for East Asia. The Chinese have also been closely observing the use of U.S. technology. They would say this too in European as well. But the use of U.S. drones, for example, the new U.S. Switchblade drones, they've been paying close attention to that. Helicopters, long-range missile attacks, close air support, urban warfare, mine warfare. So they're watching all of this very carefully, and because it does, as David said, illustrate what kinds of weapons and tactics U.S. forces would use if there were some kind of armed conflict with Taiwan. So in response, China is doing things like developing its own drones, developing its anti-submarine warfare, rocket artillery, things like that. And a really important aspect of their really kind of overall strategy, but also this is tactical as well. The Chinese military will rely on asymmetries vis-a-vis especially a more powerful opponent. So this is also kind of partly gray zone tactics, for example. And so the Chinese are working to develop these asymmetries vis-a-vis the U.S. And I think that we could probably talk about this in the Q&A if we want, but that also calls for a certain U.S. response and thinking about how we're going to meet those challenges. Okay, so that's the kind of lessons. So a fourth point I want to make is just thinking about the U.S. response to everything that's going on. And in my view, there are some unhealthy and dangerous trends in the U.S. response. So, some people saying that Ukraine is a warm-up for Taiwan, and, calls to revisit the one China policy. So, as background, I think maybe a lot of you know this, but, the Shanghai Communique in 1972, so when Nixon went over to China and, signed this agreement, in that agreement, the communique, the U.S. acknowledged one China and that Taiwan was a part of it. And so they were agnostic about who the leadership would be, but they were able to acknowledge, and certainly this has changed a little bit, as especially I think Taiwan has really changed. So the questions become a little bit different, but they were able to say, there's one China, Taiwan's a part of it, and leave who's going to, the future leadership of that one China would be. And then, of course, in the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979, the U.S. stated that they retain the right to resist the use of force against Taiwan, but not that they would definitely resist the use of force against Taiwan. And so the recent Biden statements that are indicating a firmer commitment to Taiwan is really an indication of a changing policy. So the administration has walked that back and said there's no change in policy, but I think some of these comments by Biden aren't lost on the Chinese, and so this is dangerous because it could. I mean, this is another, I think, a discussion that's it's open for debate. But I think at an extreme, something like that could embolden Taiwan, and then the U.S. is essentially on the hook for its defense if they've pledged that kind of commitment. And so this policy of strategic ambiguity that has really served the U.S. for 40, 50 years, and the calls to shift that towards strategic clarity that's not necessarily in the U.S. interest. And it's important if we're thinking about really what our overall goal is for the Taiwan Strait, which is a peaceful Taiwan Strait. The assurances that all the sides are giving to each other are also very important. And so, the assurances to mainland China about U.S. response and that it could be rewarded, if it doesn't actually use force against Taiwan. I think that's a really important part of the message that the U.S. Also needs to bring. And some of the shifts in these policy actually started from the Trump administration, but they've kind of continued into the Biden administration. And so I think it's important to consider that. And so finally, a fifth point is that I think there are some important lessons here about autocratic leadership. There's been a revival in fascism, in this great power chauvinism. I don't think it's I think it's notable that both Putin and Xi have been compared to Stalin and Mao. I think there's some good reasons for that. Both of them have surrounded themselves by yes men, and it's very hard to get countervailing information, through the leadership. In fact, supposedly, one of Putin's associates, Kozak, had negotiated a promise from the Ukrainians that they wouldn't join NATO, but Putin didn't want to listen to this and invaded anyway. And so that I think is going to be an ongoing challenge for us in, as the U.S. working with, the PRC and trying to get some of these messages across. It's important to remember that these leaders aren't quite rational. I mean, I think especially, I won't say much about Russia, but I think, especially in the Chinese case, China sees Taiwan as an important part of its historical narrative. And that is, that is a very powerful rationale for China. And so I think there's also kind of a lesson here that goes even beyond IR that we can all take away. So here we are engaging in these discussions about important global affairs. That's great. We hope all of us go out and vote. But another thing that I think we need to think about is because this is a problem in the United States too. We need better systems to keep narcissistic egomaniac tendencies in check in our leadership. I mean, if you think about, for example, the performance evaluation criteria in a lot of corporations. I mean, there's a lot of them here, Microsoft, Boeing. I mean, there's not really a criteria. I mean, you think about how much, your management or leadership, makes for the company in terms of money, and how, well they're, doing and all that. But, there's not really any criteria for, are you, not listening to your staff? Are you just, kind of this draconian leader who will, insist on getting his way or her way? So anyway, I'll end there as like a interesting takeaway for the night. Looking forward to your questions.
Please join me in thanking all of them. So I'm just going to start out with two very general questions, and either feel free to answer, all three of you answer them, or just some of you. The first one sounds like the beginning of a joke. Two men walk into a large room, I think you know where I'm going, in Bali, a room filled with acres and acres of flowers, as the newscasters have sort of described it. Neither of the two men were at the top leadership position in their earlier meetings. Now both of them are heads of state. They meet and they come out smiling. Is there something very different that has happened to the scenarios you're talking about post-Bali? The second, again, a very general kind of question. Elections, in the case of two of the examples we're using, not so much an election, but a removal, seemingly forcible removal of the previous leader at the party Congress. But in the United States, the very good possibility that we may have a Republican majority in the House. And in Taiwan, what? Is it November 27th or sometime soon? Local elections are about to take place. And if in these local elections, the dynamic between DPP and KMT or GMD changes, is there something very different to what we're talking about? Do we speculate differently? So one is about the present leading to the future, and the other is something that may happen in the future, and will that further complicate matters? Who wants to jump in?
Well, I can start with the first question anyway. It's important to recognize that the U.S. issued a national security strategy in early October. And in that strategy, essentially, President Biden, or those who wrote it for President Biden, had this line: autocrats are working overtime to undermine democracy and export a model of governance marked by repression at home and coercion abroad. And he portrayed the situation internationally as a competition between the United States, a rising China, and a descending Russia. And this was cast in basically Cold War terms. And the problem with the strategy was there was no off-ramp for that competition. There weren't any rules for that competition. There was no conditionality to that competition. If you do this, we'll stop doing that kind of thing. I think that after the meeting with Xi, that certainly the rhetoric was much less heated. There were minor agreements to have the climate change experts for both sides meet, to reestablish some low-level dialogues among embassy personnel in Beijing and Washington and so on, and an agreement to maybe step back a little bit. But I don't think anything profound has come out of that, and I suspect that, and I know from the readouts that she was absolutely insistent about the red lines on Taiwan. And Xi's vocabulary seemed to have been particularly dialed down, it seemed to me. So this is the basis for a little more time, but that may lead into the second question about how domestic politics in both places will limit, perhaps, or in all three places, will condition what countries will do.
I'll add a couple of thoughts. I think it was good in the meeting that both sides committed to not using nuclear weapons. And I also do want to, kind of underscore the point about the subnational cooperation that both sides acknowledged, the importance of. And that, I think, so, during the Obama administration, there were these senior level strategic and economic dialogues between the U.S. and China, and there was an attempt to have something similar in the Trump administration, and there was like one round, and they didn't really go anywhere. And a lot of the criticism of these talks was that they're so senior, and it's really just kind of symbolism, and nothing really gets done. But I think contrary to that thinking is really it's important to have that senior leadership signal in place so that it gives a green light to cooperation at lower levels. And we really need that. So I think it's important for us not to give up on finding areas where we can cooperate with China. We that is really important. Things like climate change and environmental issues, I think, are maybe kind of the low-hanging fruit here, if not, really, they're very challenging too. And so I think that kind of brings me to the second point when we're thinking about, just some of the divisions, as you were asking, in mainland China, Taiwan, the U.S., and looking for commonalities and, places to cooperate, I think is a theme that can be continued here. And, so I don't know if anybody's seen the new foreign affairs issue that just came out. The article on the cover is by Kevin Rudd about Xi Jinping's worldview, and essentially it talks about how she wants to revive both Leninism and Marxism. So Leninism being the kind of political control, and Marxism being the eventual kind of economic equality. And so clearly, anybody in the West is not going to want Leninist control, nor do we want communes or anything like that. But I think there is, I think we can find commonality there if we really look for it, in the fact that, do we want the crazy amounts of inequality in the world that we see? I mean, there's certainly we have different approaches to how to get to, kind of more equal distribution. But I think there's a conversation that we can actually have there. So I think it's important to, even though we have vast disagreements, still try to look for the places where you can have traction, where you can have, some agreement, and try to, kind of get outside of your usual kind of, the box of thinking that you usually inhabit, and think outside of that box, and look for kind of creative ways to find commonalities and ways to cooperate.
I think both David and Tabitha have already covered question one quite well. I'll tackle on the second question about domestic politics. So Taiwan does have a midterm election coming up, and primarily Taiwan is kind of split between two political parties. They're kind of turned green and blue, and the pan-greens are led by the current presidential administration, the Democratic Progressive Party, and the blues led by the Kuomintang, which as a party actually evolved out of the 40 years of authoritarian government rule. So this is the kind of same name that persists today as a political party in Taiwan's democratic system. Now, the DPP has been in the presidential office for the past two administrations, and it's looking like they're doing quite well. The KMT suffers from a particular kind of issue about their perspective. They have a certain policy with regards to cross-strait relations. Their idea is that we treat Beijing as if it were kind of a 2,000-pound gorilla, and how do you treat a neighbor who's there to really potentially kind of threaten you? You try to be on good terms with it, and so the KMT policy is that our best defense is friendly relations with Beijing. And so that's a policy that appeals to certain populations within Taiwan. But beyond that, the KMT kind of lacks a particular political vision for a future Taiwan that appeals to Taiwanese youth. And I think this is the main problem that the KMT faces. The last kind of successful KMT candidate, Han Kuo-yu, who ran against Tsai Ing-wen, ran on a platform that appealed to an older demographic. He ran on a platform of populism and nostalgia that will bring Taiwan back to the glory days of the KMT when everybody prospered under economic growth. And this didn't actually fare that well with the younger population because they're concerned more about China than they are. I mean, it's true that the younger population also face, wage inequality and all sorts of other economic issues. But nonetheless, the Tsai Ing-wen's victory was quite profound. And so I think that for the KMT to take a victory would be somewhat surprising, and I think would signal somewhat of a different approach towards cross-strait relations. I don't know that they'll be able to pull it off.
Thank you. Shall we open this up to the floor? If you'll go to, let's see, where are the mics? Right here. Please keep your questions to the point, and more questions than statements.
Good evening. This question is for Professor Bachman. I am interested to discuss the kind of noted change in the lack of a non-commissioned officer corps in the Chinese military. And as we know, part of that transition is also the delegation of power. Do you think that the People's Liberation Army is able culturally to make that change and to delegate and push authority down as part of its long-term force design and service culture?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I'm well positioned to give you an answer to it. I would note that one difference between the Chinese military and the Russian military is that China retains its political commissar system, political work officers designed to ensure that soldiers are loyal and motivated. And whether that compensates or not, I don't know. I suspect that I share, I think, your view that it will be very difficult for the officer corps to defer or transfer authority down to NCOs and to create a professional NCO kind of corps that really sustains the military.
This is for whoever feels best positioned to respond. Do you think that Xi and the regional Communist Party leaders in mainland China have been able to engage the population in this fervor for recovery of Taiwan to the same degree or more than Putin has been very successful in engaging the entire Russian population to be behind his war in Ukraine?
Well, I'm not sure I accept the premise that there's broad support in either place. I think we hear one voice, but whether that represents what people really think is another thing. That clearly, if you were to say, oh, there's no problem if Taiwan were to become independent, that would be on social media in China for about 2 seconds. And in Russia, I suspect that that again, we're hearing one side overwhelmingly. Now, it is very true that in both places there are quite avid, insistent voices demanding, in fact, continue with the war in Ukraine, to take over Taiwan, that anything less than taking over Taiwan almost immediately is a sellout. This is certainly representative of some fragment of Chinese population or of Russian population. But as the Russian population is discovering slowly that wars have costs, that these things don't necessarily go as intended. So I'm not sure. I mean, as I said, the Party Congress was one where we're worried about the international environment, but was also one where the party was sort of almost totally divorced from society, I think, in the sense of not acknowledging the slowdown in the economy, the problems in the the housing sector, the anger at the lockdowns and so on, so that you have this party superstructure sitting on top of this base that I think actually pretty unstable at this point, other than a surveillance system and a system of public security designed to forestall public protest. So I think that there's lots of fissures in both societies, and both leaderships are trying to use nationalism to overcome some of these things. How persuasive that is, I don't know.
I'll add something. I don't feel comfortable necessarily commenting on the Russian experience, but I will say though that I think that at the very least, Xi's stated commitment to the reunification of China with Taiwan, that has approval, widespread approval from the Chinese citizenry. You know, kind of as part of you know, the goal of national rejuvenation for the Chinese nation. But I don't know if that would extend to actual war. But I think one of the you know, one of the kind of confounding factors here is that there's a danger in that the younger generations in both China and Taiwan, mainland China and Taiwan, have not had any experience with war. And, so the older generations, really on both sides of the strait, have, and I think especially in mainland China, have this experience of the 20th century being, terrible, brutal. And so, those kind of currently older generations of Chinese don't want an experience of instability like that again. And so that, I think that's a really interesting question. How would these younger populations, necessarily view things? And I think, to kind of add to the point about nationalism, I think, so for the CCP, if, its the two main tools of legitimacy are nationalism and economic growth, certainly, nationalism can kind of supersede economic growth, and we've seen that over the course of the 20th century too, with previous Taiwan Strait crises, so it'd be interesting to like how that would be leveraged and if that would be successful. So I think those are kind of the things to pay attention to.
Thank you. That was really very informative and very timely discussion. My name is Anis Rahman. I'm a communication teaching faculty, and thanks to Jackson School, I teach money and power in international communication, focusing on technology. So my question is related to technology. So I wonder if the war narrative-driven zero-sum game and Thucydides trap understanding of Russia conflict narrative or framework is adequate, or even good match to understand China-Taiwan conflict vis-a-vis United States interest? Or is there a better narrative, for example, collaboration, interdependence, and competition, focusing on the technological interdependence that these three countries maintain? For example, in the computer chips industry, which is one of the most richest or the biggest financial intensive industry, 90% of advanced chips is produced in Taiwan, and 60% of the semiconductor is produced in Taiwan, especially by TSMC. So Nancy Pelosi's visit with the CEO of that, Mark Liu, has intensified Taiwan's intention to convert or divert many of their manufacturing fabrication plants to United States, starting with Arizona, tapping into the $52 billion funding. So that's where China's anxiety also comes from, because it makes only 5%, whereas US makes 10%. So the deeper integration between Taiwan and US means a less success of getting the chips making equipments they need for their own domestic needs, which is quite big. So I wonder if we look at that point of view, if that can be a helpful entry point for, as you pointed out, what is the conversation we can make that is there is commonality between these nations? Thank you.
James, you want to?
Sure. Yeah, I think in this case, Taiwan is also somewhat caught between, I guess, multiple directions. So the United States, it seems like most recently Biden's decision to seek decoupling with China is going to have an outsized impact upon Taiwan's semiconductor industry. Taiwan is well aware that there's this perception that it possesses a so-called silicon shield, that the importance of Taiwan's semiconductor industry means that and I think the most recent estimates places, if there's any kind of blockade or military conflict over the Taiwan Strait, the damage to global GDP would be in trillions of US dollars, which is an astounding number. And I think it's a believable number. We're seeing the kind of effects of that from Ukraine, which is an economy that is not as globally integrated as Taiwan's. So Taiwan is placed in a position where it has to kind of follow the direction of Washington, which is its closest ally. But at the same time, this directive to decouple, I think, harms Taiwan's own silicon shield. And so I'm not quite sure exactly how they're going to seek to balance that. I think, it probably doesn't have too much choice in the matter. I think that the decision to decouple largely comes from a political decision from Washington. And that's something I think that, maybe I'll let David and Tabitha speak to that. Go
I know you have things to say about this. I've heard you say them.
Certainly, one could say that up to the Trump administration, the coalitions in American politics that sustained U.S.-China relations despite growing tensions were the business community and to some extent the academic community, where we had this image of exactly this cooperation, contacts at lower levels, doing business and cooperating. And one result of the Trump administration, and it's been followed through by the Biden administration, is to have geostrategy trump, to use a phrase, business concerns. And I think there is a fair degree of bipartisan consensus within the two parties that China is a security threat for the United States. There are think tanks and government commissions that are reporting about what's called civil-military fusion in China, where we're cutting off the access to the chips that go into many of the equipment that would be part of the next generation of Chinese weapon systems and capabilities. And so there is obviously a sort of a sense that strategic rivalry has replaced the basis for many forms of cooperation. The real trick to your question is how you get back to figuring out cooperation. And I don't have a good answer for that. That if you read the Biden national security strategy and the national defense strategy that was released shortly thereafter, it really sounds a lot like the Cold War all over again. If you know your Cold War history, the Biden national security strategy sounds a lot like President Truman's speech that announced the Truman Doctrine, that democracy versus autocracy, and that's been the Biden administration's line about China since it came into office. Very hard to figure out how you proceed with business if you're fundamentally saying your two different systems are in fundamental competition with each other. So I'm at a loss here to build a more cooperative relationship unless you get each side agreeing to gradually step down on issues that matter. It's sort of tit-for-tat reduction of competition. But that requires much more than the Biden-Xi summit to get to.
Hi, my name is Jesse. I'm a graduate from the history department here at UW, and we had an earlier question about like public sentiment regarding war, and I'd like to just continue on that. And I think I can actually provide like a very quick background as towards the Chinese public sentiment, since I do have some engagement with that for the youth. And like at the beginning of the conflict, like on Chinese social media, there was almost overwhelming support for Putin and the invasion, and not necessarily from government sources, but from nationalistic citizens and youth. But I think very interestingly, as the course of the war progressed and as Russia's failure became more evident, there's been a very noticeable change in that trend. And if the war in Iraq was the war on television, then the war in Ukraine now is a war on social media. And there is a very, and like the Chinese netizens have been getting a very good numbers of like things like videos. We have like TikTok videos by civilians and soldiers on the front line. There's a good number of both Russian and Ukrainian vloggers, content creators on like video platforms like Bilibili, and people sharing about experiences living in a war zone in Ukraine, and also experiences of young Russian citizens being drafted and or trying to escape the draft, and things like that. And as the the reality and of the brutality of war dawns on a lot of people, and I think now the discussion within China on social media is much more nuanced. It's less, I wouldn't say more support for the Ukrainian government, but definitely more sympathy for the Ukrainian people, and definitely less support for Putin's regime, especially with how they're drafting poor people. And there are like videos of like Russian conscripts being told they have to buy their own medical supplies, using like tampons to stop wounds, that kind of stuff. And I'm just curious. I mean, China as a nation, it has been a very peaceful nation, as unlike Russia or the U.S., who's been engaged in warfare almost constantly. There's not been war in China for 40 years, 50 years, and people are worried about the prospect. And is such public sentiment something that will affect Chinese policy? To what extent will it affect on Chinese policy? And would the Chinese government care about such things? And also on the Taiwanese side, I'm curious to know, especially as Russia's failure become more evident, what are the Taiwanese youth thinking about it? Has there been a change in sentiment from the initial outbreak? That's my question.
Thanks for the comment. That was really great. Really great comment and question. What's coming up in my mind is I think what's important to remember about China, and this is not just vis-a-vis Russia, but I think also North Korea. China has been a lot more successful in its economic development. Really along a lot of metrics in the past 40 years, and having close, previous alliances or at least partnerships now with places like Russia and North Korea, which are really, you could argue, failed states in many ways. It puts China in an uncomfortable position. I think there's some grappling with that goes on, and I think for a lot of the Chinese population, I mean, they're aware of some of those differences, and I think I think that it's kind of like a friendship of convenience in many ways between China and Russia. I mean, they have their own. They've kind of been pushed together more than there's like a pull towards each other, and they have their own, just historic conflictual issues as well. And I also think another thing to keep in mind too is there's there in the past 10 years I think it was harder for the Chinese population to be critical of Xi Jinping. I mean, it's still hard to be to express that in China, but now that Xi has definitely really extended beyond the previously acceptable term limits of 10 years. I think it's I think there's a bit of a shift now in thinking about Xi Jinping, and even though you might not see this obviously very widely in China because everything is so controlled, I think there's some more questioning that's going on now along with everything you're saying. So it'll be interesting to watch. I mean, I think at the same time, leaders like Xi Jinping and Putin are very paranoid, so that also doesn't bode well for the future. But those are kind of my thoughts on that.
Go ahead.
Okay. Tabitha earlier mentioned that most military experts believe that any kind of PRC invasion, if it's seeking to occupy Taiwan, would have to be big and fast. And that's partially because there's a belief that a decapacitation of Taiwanese political leadership would result in Taiwanese society seeking to capitulate very quickly. And that was the kind of general line of thinking before the Ukraine invasion. I don't have access to or remember polling data off the top of my head, But anecdotally speaking, I think that's starting to change. I think that's in part perhaps due to Taiwanese youth consuming different aspects of Ukraine war through social media. And I just want to raise back once again, the anecdote that I was conveying from Michelle Guo, whose friend was discussing, I think this was over dinner, discussing the idea of, will you stay or will you fight during the possibility of an invasion? And I think prior to the Ukraine war, probably most would have said, why stay? But I think now that's changing quite a bit probably because of the success that Ukraine is having, and that many Taiwanese feel that sense of solidarity with what Ukraine is undergoing. And I think that many young Taiwanese have the perspective that, we will do the same. And so, anecdotally speaking, that's kind of what I'm hearing, and I don't know if that's, or how widespread that is.
And one quick side note to the excellent comments my colleagues ever mentioned, that most of the Chinese Army's enlisted men are product of the one-child family. And so to the extent that the costs of the war in Ukraine are hitting home to Chinese families, and thought, well, my son, my family line can conceivably be wiped out, that's something that will cause people to think.
Hi, my name's Isaiah. I'm a undergrad student in the Jackson School. There's one particular statement that really just kind of caught my ear throughout this whole conversation, and that was Xi Jinping's sort of call to revive Leninism and Marxism. Now, certainly it seems that Chinese currently have a pretty Leninist approach towards political dissidents, but when it comes to Marxism, they seem to have a sort of anti-democratic and not very Marxist social structure. So to what degree do you think this call to revive these ideologies is done in earnest? And to what degree do you think it's sort of nationalist lip service meant to provide a feeling of unity, I guess, amongst the populace who at the moment seem to be fairly divided thanks to the whole political situation as well as the economic situation?
Great question, and yes, thanks for clarifying. I mean, I would argue too that there hasn't been a revival in Leninism in China. It just never stopped. I mean, it's always been Leninist, and really the starting with the beginning of the reform and opening up period is when there was deviation away from the Marxist part of it, and now. So I think what's really, I mean, this is not my argument. This was the this Kevin Rudd's article. But I mean, so I can't really, I think I maybe anecdotally can say, give an opinion, but I do think there is something genuine about Xi's plan to revive Marxism. And I've seen this, I mean, it's been a little while since I've been to China, but one of the last trips I was there, this was 2019, again, anecdotally, I was struck by some of the conversations I was having in which people were saying, yes, we really do still believe in this, kind of socialist vision. And, the idea was, well, Marx said you had to go through a period of capitalism before you get to the stage of socialism. And, we skipped it and that was a mistake. And, so here we are. But I do think there, so I think the thought has been that it was really just lip service. But what that article is arguing, and I think is, I think there's some truth to this, is that there is a genuine motivation to revive Marxism. So.
I saw a presentation today by the Stanford sociologist Andrew Walder, where he was making the argument that this is a very unequal system, and that Marxism would be a profound critique of the current system in the PRC. It could be very dangerous for the Communist Party and the oligarchs in China to take this seriously. There are more billionaires in China, according to various lists, than there are in the US. So how did that happen? And the state, Walder was arguing, has very little redistributive capacity. That the China economist Barry Naughton 5 years ago has an article about, is China still socialist, in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, because of this inability to deal with transferring resources from the haves to the have-nots and so on. So there has been, for at least 2 decades, I guess now going on 3, a sort of neo-Maoist, neo-Marxist kind of group in China that have been critiquing the reforms. But if she opens the door for discussions of this kind, and he's raising the slogan again of letting 100 flowers bloom, 100 schools of thought contend, which has been often both an invitation to present views, but at the same time leads to a crackdown, that this would be one where you could imagine lots of fundamental critiques of the current reality in the PRC taking place. So I'm not sure what exactly Rudd is thinking when he's saying this, or what Xi Jinping means by it. And if you read Xi's party speech, he talks about developing Marxism, but there's no real Marxist analysis.
I'll just add that if we look at PRC history, when Marxism-Leninism was taken doctrinally quite seriously, that in the 1950s, the PRC looked very different from what it looks like today. And I just have to agree with Walder, with Naughton, that the PRC state structure as it exists today I think it's not Marxist, and I think it's not Leninist either. I mean, Lenin was advocating for the party as the vanguard for a global proletarian revolution, and that's not happening in the PRC. The working class in the PRC today is not even in control of their own government. So yes, I think that Kevin Rudd probably needs to read up on Naughton and Walder.
Hi, I'm Nathan. I'm a freshman here at the UW, so forgive me. I was wondering when Dr. James was talking about youth in Taiwan and youth in at least Taipei or Taiwan, and how the KMT is like beginning to, I guess, become less favorable or less favorable toward people with youth. I was wondering specifically, I believe there's a candidate in Taipei, Zhang Wen'an, and I believe I looked and I said, I seen that Taipei is, like the mayoral candidate of Taipei is like a stepping stone towards Taiwanese presidency. And there, I believe in some estimates there is a good chance that Zhang Wen'an has a good chance of at least taking Taipei. I was wondering, does this, and I also read that Zhang Wen'an is less, I guess, ideologically a bit more different from like traditional KMT ideology and may appeal more towards the youth of Taipei. I was wondering if that, because of Zhang Wen'an and his potential jump, I guess, to power, what does this have? What implications does this have on, I guess, KMT, the future of the KMT, and more specifically the future of Taiwan, if like both leading parties are more, I guess, geared towards independence or leaning towards, I guess, less of the old ideology of the KMT.
Yeah. So Zhang Wen'an, of course, from his surname, same surname as Jiang Jieshi, Chiang Kai-shek. And I think that, there's, I think, a little bit of that purposeful connection when he kind of campaigns that there's an old aspect of the KMT that some still find that connection to have some power for them. I think that this is largely gone within the young population, that his surname does nothing for them, and in fact probably turns him into kind of a negative candidate. But you are right to point out that the youth, and Zhang Wen'an is kind of the young, representing the youth of the KMT, don't really have as firm of an ideology as the older, kind of old guard, the deep blues within the KMT. And so it's not quite clear to me exactly. His policy platform is not particularly solid. it's not quite clear to me exactly how he would pursue kind of a cross-strait policy other than, kind of the old KMT formula of kind of maintaining friendly relations as kind of our best defense. I should also mention that I think one of the differences between the youth within the KMT as represented by Jiang Wannan and others like him is that they have a more pro-Taiwan position than the Deep Blue. So the Deep Blues still consider themselves to be Chinese, and they carry that over from when they came over from the mainland in 1949. But Jiang Wannan grew up in a very different Taiwan, and even though he might run on a KMT party platform, foreign policy that is friendly to Beijing, I think that in terms of his identity, he has a more modern Taiwanese identity. And so this is probably the one aspect that might draw youth votes away from the DPP. But like you, I'm also very curious to see what the Taipei mayoral election, how it plays out. It's currently kind of split between 3 parties, which is something that's a little bit unusual, potential spoiler. And also, you're right to say that the mayor typically has been the stepping stone to the presidency. Taipei is the largest city in Taiwan. It's almost like a third of the population. So unlike, kind of like the mayor of New York, it's actually a serious kind of national platform. And so many of Taiwan's past presidents, like Ma Ying-jeou, Chen Shui-bian, have been former mayors. And so I think that there is the real possibility that Jiang Wannan has his sights set higher. So we'll see.
I think we've got time for one more short question, and then
One more short question. I'm just very curious to hear what you guys have to say about what you think the American response, the American government response would be to an invasion of Taiwan by the PLA. By my understanding, I would imagine that first would be an attempt to invade Taiwan, or to solve that issue with economic means. But if there is an eventual physical invasion using arms, what you guys believe would be the response by the US and by Europe and Australia and other allies?
Who's the military
Yeah.
expert?
Sorry, that may not be
No,
the
no,
short question it was supposed to be. I apologize.
Well, the answer may not be. But I take, at least as in a Biden administration, I take President Biden at his word. In the event of an attack on Taiwan, U.S. military forces would be would put into harm's way to come to Taiwan's defense. If China were to invade, I mean, my scenario would be there would be attacks on Okinawa, which would draw Japan in, attacks on Guam, U.S. territory. So we would be at war with the People's Republic of China in the event of a Taiwan invasion, which is why Tabitha and others have been suggesting, let's make deterrence strong so that we can, on the one hand, deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan, but also assure the PRC that the United States is not about to cross its red line. Now, what a post-Biden administration would be, and when there is a post-Biden administration, what its policy would be, who knows?
I think that was a good response. I think I'll just quickly add that I mean, there's a lot of discussion about planning for this right now, and there's kind of a race to so as the Chinese are bringing online new capabilities, the U.S. is also bringing online some new capabilities, and whether or not they can, the U.S. can do it in time to respond to the Chinese. So there's one of the responses to this anti-access aerial denial is called active denial. So the idea is that the U.S. forces currently right now are too concentrated, both in terms of their aircraft carriers and the basing, and so could you match the Chinese kind of asymmetric strategies by making communication centers and basing and forces kind of more independent of each other, so that there's and more spread out, so not just concentrated in certain bases, so that when like the Chinese attack Okinawa, that's it, So there's kind of a a push to do that. I mean, who knows? I mean, hopefully we'll avoid this, right? But I think in terms of the deterrence, so what I would say, so when you've got someone like Pelosi going to Taiwan in a very public way, and this, like I said earlier, this really started during the Trump administration, where you have these kind of like, open, widely publicized visits that, were much more kind of on the DL before, on the down low before. When, I think a better message would be to not be so public about it, and not be so, I mean, the Chinese kind of find that offensive, and so it ratchets up tensions. And so if you could instead, without publicizing this, make it very clear that the U.S. has a very powerful presence in Asia without broadcasting that, I mean, that to me seems like a much more credible deterrent that's likely to be listened to than something, than these like, politicians going to Taiwan and having it broadcast all over the news and just, essentially provoking China. I mean, I think if you're really, aiming at the goal here, which is, like, let's not go to war, to me, that kind of way of handling it is much more effective. So that's.
Please join me in thanking my fellow panelists and the audience. Thank you all very much.